What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode. And I'm holding up here in my hand, those of you who are listening, I'm holding up a copy of this Sunday's Business Post. And it's today is the 6th of July. And the front page headline is MKN Property Group has basically announced that it is laying off about 50% of its workforce. Why? Because it has run out of work. This is a house building firm with no work to do in 2025. I shit you not. One of the directors, Brian McKeown, he says that there's a quotation here: extreme difficulty securing planning for projects. And this comes shortly after Rick Larkin's firm Twinlight confirmed that it was also exiting the housing development business. And so you have to wonder, like, what is the government at? Like, how many more stories like this have to come out before we'll start to see action being taken? And if you listen to my previous podcasts on this kind of topic, we've covered the planning problems being, one of the main ones, but there's various other ones, and I'll mention some of these today. But the Business Post, using the Freedom of Information Act, it managed to get a hold of a number of reports that have been prepared in recent months for Housing Minister James Brown by senior civil servants in the government. And what it is announcing internally is that planning permissions have plateaued over the last year. And what they have is they have this analysis that they prepared in May. And they said that we need about 404,000 planning permissions between the years 2022 and 2027. There needs to be that many lodged, that many homes that applications have been lodged for, in order to provide enough work for developers to build 300,000 homes between 2025 and 2030. So you can see there's a bit of a time lag there. They're saying that from 2022 to 2027, that's when the permissions go in. And then from 2025 to 2030, that's when the actual homes get built. And they're saying 404 applications, or applications for 404,000 units, would be required to deliver 300,000. And it's based on this very simplistic assumption that 75% of planning applications will be successful in that time period. Now, the only thing is if you go and look into the figures, you'll see that between 2022 and 2024, we needed, in order to kind of deliver on that 404 number, we would have delivered on 64,000 approvals. However, in that time frame, we've only seen 32,400 approvals. So you can see we are so far off, and you kind of wonder who is coming up with all of these reports that are making these assumptions that are based on, 75%. Like, most people will tell you that planning applications, they're very, very difficult these days. You have essentially three bites at the cherry now, the people who want to object to them. A developer will go out, buy a piece of land, and they will go and apply for planning permission to put a housing development or whatever it is that they're looking to build. They'll go and they'll submit that application. They'll meet with the local authority, the planning department, and the various departments inside, like roads and drainage and all of those kind of different departments. And at the end of that process, with a bit of luck, if you're not being overly aggressive in terms of what you're trying to achieve, you will get a grant of planning. Now, that's supposed to take 8 to 12 weeks. It usually takes a lot longer, but let's just say it was done in 8 to 12 weeks. That 8 to 12 week period is when people can submit what's known as observations. And if you submit an observation, you can then object to the scheme if it gets the grant. You can appeal it. And it means that onboard planola is the second bite of the cherry. So if you made your observation, you wrote to the local authority, you said, I don't like this development, I don't want it to be built. And then the local authorities say, we need to build houses here, we're going to overrule that objection, and we're just going to say, you know what, we've taken on board the observation, but we've decided to give the grant anyway. So that person who submitted the observation is unhappy, and they decide, you know what we're going to do? We're going to go and we're going to appeal this to An Bord Pleanála. So they go and they submit it to An Bord Pleanála, and that adds approximately another 9 months, maybe even longer, but like 9 months is the kind of traditional length of time that it would take. So you're now into a year of waiting for your planning permission. And so An Bord Pleanála will do all of its reports and look at everything. And then after deliberation, they may decide, you know what, we agree with the local authority. We're going to go and we're going to grant this planning permission. And so they give the go ahead. And that used to be the end of it. But then what came along was the judicial review process. And that is now where somebody decides they're not happy with An Bord Pleanála's decision. They want to now take it to the courts. And the courts are actually getting involved in all this kind of stuff. And so it adds additional time to the project. And by which stage, a lot of the time, the project is so long in there that fundamental things may have changed. Like in the time frame it takes for you to get permission, the market might have shifted into a different direction. Or you might all of a sudden find that costs no longer support what you're trying to build because of inflation or whatever. So there's all sorts of stuff. Like what you really want a process where you buy a site, you go for planning, 8 weeks later, you get your planning and you're straight onto site. And you've got, guys digging, building, pouring foundations within 12 to 18 months, you could have a house built from purchase of site. That is no longer anything even near possible. Most of the time, you're looking at 2 to 3 years before you have anything. Now, when we go and have a look at, let me just open up the newspaper here. I went to the Property Plus section. And the Property Plus section, it's like what you often see in the residential section of most newspapers during the week. But if you turn to page 5, there is a full page advert from Ashcroft Developments, and it reads, "Development land wanted. To support our growing pipeline of residential projects, Ashcroft Developments are seeking to acquire ready-to-go and zoned land in the Dublin, Greater Dublin and Leinster area. Ideally, the land will be to support housing schemes of between 40 and 200 units." And you can go ahead and contact them if you're interested in doing this. This is another major house builder advertising to try to get land. I mean, it just, if ever there was a sign of the system breaking down, these are the clear symbols of it, in my opinion. And it just seems like the message is just not getting through. It's kind of ridiculous. Meanwhile, and this is what's absolutely horrific about this whole situation. So you've got house builders trying to build houses, and you've got people out there, like huge demand for houses, and you've got housing authorities looking to buy, and you've got all of this stuff going on, and yet the planning system holds all of that stuff up. And yet when there is the asylum seekers coming into the country, and a lot of the time they arrive either by boat from the UK or they arrive on a plane. And in the process of travelling to Ireland, they have somehow lost their passport. Now, you're not allowed on an airplane without some form of ID, but somehow that ID is lost, whether it's flushed down the toilet or whatever. These guys that arrive at our country and at our shores, they apply for refugee status as asylum seekers, and they say that they're trying to escape from war or violence, and I mean, in those situations when it's genuine, of course we would like to support those kind of people, but it seems from the different reports that I'm hearing that a lot of this is just economic refugees, that they're actually coming from the UK, so they're already in a country that's not war torn. And they've come from there to come to Ireland. Why? Because our system is a little bit on the soft side. And so IPAS, that's the Immigrant Protection Accommodation Services, I think, or Immigrant Protection Accommodation Services. That is the one that is the agency that goes and puts all of these refugees in a home. And IPAS schemes that are going to house these huge numbers of refugees that are coming into the country, those are exempted from the planning system. So you can build a IPAS centre pretty much wherever you want. It's got to comply with certain regulations and things like that, but it doesn't have to go through the planning process. So whilst the builders that want to build stuff get turned down at every turn because of this system, you have the IPAS centres just popping up wherever and nobody really has a say. The only time that you hear about them is when they're in the news because there is some sort of controversy over the locals picketing it or something like that, or firebombing it or whatever it might be. So all of this is happening at the same time, and you kind of wonder, like, is that the problem? They don't mind those things popping up everywhere as an exempted thing, but when it comes to housing, that has to go through all of these hoops, and it just seems crazy to me. The RPZ reforms, so they brought out these reforms recently, and it was just, I believe it was just signed into law in the last week or two, that the entire country is now deemed to be a rent pressure zone, the entire country. And what this has done, this has caused hundreds and hundreds of landlords to decide, nope, I'm out and I'm getting out. And there have been hundreds of eviction notices served on tenants. And these might be perfectly good tenants that have never done anything wrong, but by fiddling around with the system, the government have gone and introduced more uncertainty at a time when people are kind of on the edge as it is. And so there's going to be a huge amount of people who just decide, you know what, I'm getting out. I'm not going to bother with this anymore. A lot of the time, what it is, people who decide to buy a house, it's not because they're greedy landlords who want to, buy up all the properties and charge rent to everyone. What it is, and it's certainly in my case, it would have been that I have children, I have 5 kids, and I'm hoping that when they go to university, that they won't have to go and find a place and fight off all the others, that I'll actually have a place that I can go and rent to them. And that would be, the ambition of a lot of people, simply to have a place that their kids can use when they're in university. And maybe they can be left the property when the parents pass on or whatever it might be. But that's kind of like a fairly ordinary, not so ambitious requirement in most people's mind, is I want to look after the kids. And yet this new law, the reforms to change the rent pressure zones, that's causing a lot of people to just reconfigure their thinking on that and just say, do you know what, it's not worth it. It's not, let's just get out. And this is because of the 6-year deadline or the 6-year guaranteed tenancy that is now going to be brought in from the 1st of March. So the people that are serving notice on their tenants right now, they're doing that because it's 6 months to about January. And in January, they were hoping to get the house back. And if they don't get the house back, they have about 8 weeks until the 1st of March. And if they don't, if in those 8 weeks, they have got to get the house vacant in order that this new 6-year right to tenancy doesn't kick in. And so that's what people are doing. They're kind of rushing it now so that by January the tenant is out. And if the tenant refuses to get out, they're going to basically have 8 weeks to try to evict them through the courts or through force or whatever it might be. Now, what's this going to do? It means around January, there's going to be hundreds of people out on the streets trying to find accommodation because they're being evicted by their landlords, because the landlords have had enough and have just decided, okay, you know what, let's just put the house on the market. They're not going to rent it for the couple of months between January and March. And what they're going to do instead is just keep it vacant. And then on the 1st of March, either they sell the property and somebody else can come along and they can buy it with a clean, empty house. And if somebody does feel like renting a property for 6 years, they can put a new tenant in, and that new tenant goes in on a market rent. The people that are getting out are the people that have been stuck for years on a lower rent because of the RPZ system. And so it's just, all of this is just, it's like an endless merry-go-round of fumble after fumble after fumble. Now, last month, another thing came up, and this is just, it's another kind of staggering thing that just all of the guys inside of my mastermind, we're all scratching our heads trying to wonder. So the housing minister pulled the plug on almost 500 houses, social homes, that were about to get started. And this is on 6 different sites around the country. 244 of the homes were going to be in Dublin. The rest of them were going to be outside between Kildare, Wicklow and Sligo. And the reason that it's being pulled is because of what they're saying is it doesn't look like good value for money. And the reality is this was what's known as a PPP scheme, a public-private partnership. And the idea behind a public-private partnership is that the public agrees to fund something over a long period of time, and the private sector goes and puts it together, and it's in a kind of a form of partnership. And what has been spent so far on these almost 500 social homes, 8 million has already been spent on this project. And apparently 1,400 people employed across all of the different projects. And the idea behind the PPP model was that this was being funded, this was being built, this was being managed, and all of this was being done on behalf of the government. And at the end of 25 years, the government basically, the houses get refurbished and they get handed over to the government, and the government then owns them outright. But for a 25-year period, these will be run and managed on behalf of the government. And the government took a look at the price tag and just said, nope, that's too expensive. We're going to do something completely different. Now, the problem is these projects were shovel ready and they were literally weeks from actually going on site. And so for it to happen at this essentially last minute, is really, really bad. Obviously, the PPP system, it does look expensive from the outside, but that's because there's all sorts of additional services being provided by external parties that are going to do these over the next 25 years. And so I don't know, I just wonder, is there any hope in sight? Like when you look at all this kind of stuff, you think, I'm hearing anecdotal evidence that stories from different people that I've heard around why were they costing so much. And I heard things like that the design was very much a sustainable design. They had lots and lots of carbon footprint reducing features, such as green roofs and all of the solar panels and all of the stuff that would mean that these properties are run very efficiently and that they don't have a huge carbon footprint. And that is a big thing nowadays. Like everyone wants to make sure that there's an A1 rated property and things like that. And it gets pulled because those features cost money. And instead, let's just reduce the price and let's get rid of all those carbon footprint reducing features and let's just get the thing done on the cheap. That's what seems to be the general message. Now, on Friday's Irish Times, I was reading the front page report that Ireland is so far away from achieving its legally binding emissions reduction targets that it is now on course for as much as a €26 billion fine from the EU. Apparently, our targets for 2030 are that we're supposed to have reduced our emissions by 51% compared with the numbers from 2018. And we're supposed to be at 51% by 2030. We're currently at 12%. So we are so far away from achieving it that we are going to fail dismally on this. And when we fail on that, what is it going to mean? It's going to mean that Ireland is fined a staggering sum of money from the EU. And where would that money be better spent? Would it be better spent on a big check to the EU for failing to meet the emissions? Or would these projects that were going to have these bells and whistles that actually help reduce these costs, would they have perhaps, helped to push down the overall emissions target figure? Anyway, you got to think about this, and you kind of wonder, like, when are we going to stop talking about it, and when are we going to actually start taking some action? You've got the planning delays. This is not a new thing. We've been talking about planning reforms and speeding up the planning process for about 15 years now. Ever since 2014, 2015, when suddenly the boom, not the boom, but when the market began again after the huge crash that we went through. Since that period, people have been talking about how long it takes to get planning. That is still an issue today, despite the fact that we're in a housing crisis. The cost of designing apartments and building regulations for houses and building, particularly apartments, it is so expensive to build an apartment, between putting in the cores and the elevators, and if you need to put in basement car parking, then it's astronomical. But there's all sorts of additional costs. There's open green space you can't build on, has to be green space. I understand these are all done for a reason, but what it does do is it pushes up the cost per unit that is actually built. Then when you add to that the levies, the connection fees, the VAT that you have to deduct on the sales, all of that happens, and you end up that the average cost of an apartment, if you're going to build an apartment in this country, it's probably going to cost you per apartment about 400,000, 440, 450,000, in that kind of ballpark. That's when you roll up everything. When you roll up your costs of financing and the site and everything like that. The total cost is so high that most parts of the country are just not economically viable. Dublin is, because you could build something like that, and your fallback position, if you're unable to sell it in one big lump to a fund or something like that, is you could go and maybe sell it off individually to individuals. But if you go to parts of Dublin where it's working class or something like that, you might be able to find apartments for 250 grand in those locations. So who's going to pay 450,000 just to break even? So it's just too risky. So a lot of people are just not going to go down that road. And the only way they're going to do it is if they have a backstop of the government saying, yes, I'll buy it, or big funds saying, yes, we'll buy it, and they'll sign a legally binding contract. If the government can just suddenly pull the plug because they don't like the direction it's going or something like that, then you just wonder, most people will just get out, and that's what we're seeing. And then finally, I don't think there's enough zoned land. And it's not just, it's like one thing saying that this land is now zoned, like that's a stroke of a pen. But zoned land has to be serviced land as well, which means there has to be the ability to get water there. You have to have the ability to get power there, and you have to have the ability to remove sewage waste from those sites. And that's what we mean by serviced land. And that is not happening at a rate that's supposed to be. The latest that I've been hearing or been reading is that the whole Dublin area is close to something like 95% capacity now in terms of its treatment of sewage. And so we're not going to be able to build any more houses in Ireland, in Dublin certainly, because we don't have the wastewater capacity to actually remove the waste from all the houses that we need to build. And so that's going to be the next thing. And apparently there have been, for about the last 10 or 15 years, there have been plans to make these improvements to these facilities, but they've been delayed for some reason, for one reason or another. So guys, I don't know what you think, but I'm certainly of the view that this is not going anywhere quickly. And so I think we can all expect the next, say, 10, 15 years is more of the same. We're going to continue to have a housing crisis. We're going to continue to have landlords departing the market, tenants fighting and squabbling for fewer and fewer properties, which is going to push up rents, and then house builders and construction firms just getting out of the housing sector because there's just too much regulation and just too difficult to get stuff built and not enough certainty at the outcome. And so I think unless the government pulls up its socks and actually does something, maybe even, bring in tax breaks or something like that makes these schemes more financially viable, then I think we can just look forward to more of the same. So guys, let me know what you think. I'm curious, am I on my own thinking this, or do we all agree that the government needs to do a lot more and quickly? All right, guys, take it easy. See you in the next one.